in terms of maternal love kicking in, you do sometimes hear about women who don't find it that easy, that there is variation in how
completely.
quickly maternal love kicks in. What factors affect that? What do we know about how that is induced?
There are various reasons for that. Some of them are psychological reasons. Some of them are genetic reasons. So some of the psychological reasons might be, for example, that the process of pregnancy itself or the birth was traumatic, and trauma can definitely make it much, much harder to bond. It might be that the mother experiences postnatal depression or even prenatal depression, and that makes it much harder to bond. It can be that their own experience of being parented. So how you were parented, because of that 2 years after birth where your brain is growing like mad, that 2 years in particular builds the architecture of your social brain. And if you as a child experience not very healthy relationships during that time, unfortunately, your architecture can sometimes not be the best, your brain architecture for being in good relationships when you're an adult. So it can be some mothers suffer because their own relationships when they were developing weren't very good. And therefore they don't have the neurochemical architecture to be very good at doing this. There can also be genetic reasons. There are a set of genes that underpin your social abilities, your ability to form relationships. And there is one set of genes related to oxytocin, which affect really how sensitive you are as a parent and how easily you attach to your child as a parent. And so those, again, could impact your ability. And we just know that some people struggle more with all relationships. So again, they might have a set of genes that makes them struggle. They might have low circulating oxytocin, for example. Oxytocin is really important in the first stages of forming a bond. And if you have low circulating oxytocin, then you are less inclined and less kind of motivated to build bonds. So it could be that from a neurochemical point of view, you just find it hard to build bonds, regardless of who they're with. So there's sort of a mix of reasons why mothers might struggle. And it generally is a mix between sort of environmental, psychological factors and genetic factors. There's no sort of clear cut thing. What I would say to any parent who finds it hard to bond is you're not alone for a start. More parents than we know find it hard to bond. It's a bit of a taboo to talk about because we have this belief that, baby comes out, you get a flood of love. It's amazing. And actually, if you talk to parents confidentially, a significant number don't feel that. And sometimes don't feel that for months. And so we have to normalize that and say that's perfectly normal. That's absolutely fine. And that there are interventions, there are things we can help people do with their babies to help them do that, to help them develop the bonds. So it's not like a closed door. If you find it hard initially, that it's always going to be like that. Quite often, it will either develop on its own or, specialists can intervene and help you and build very, very good bonds with your baby.
I want to ask what those interventions look like. But first, on this question about bonding, at the risk of sounding morbid, we do know that infanticide has been a part of human history for a long time. Is this poor bonding, in some instances, based on things like trauma, based on lack of social support? Might that lead to it as well? Are these the kind of triggers in the environment that might, in the ancestral environment, have given rise to thoughts of infanticide, and might poor bonding sometimes be an emotional prelude to that? If that makes sense.
I would say I'm not a specialist in infanticide, and I think it's something that we have to be very careful talking about because actually the statistics on it are incredibly low. Yeah. Very, very few people kill their babies. In the environment in which we evolved, actually, infanticide tended to be practiced by males who are unrelated to the baby. Mm-hmm. And the reason why that happens is because by killing if a male comes into a group, let's talk about, I don't know, gorillas. Okay. In gorillas, if a male comes into a group, sometimes he will kill the nursing babies in the group because it brings the females back into estrus. They are fertile again, and then he will be there to look after his babies because they're not his babies. That tends to be why infanticide occurs in other animals. And in humans, it's actually very, very rare. So no, I would not say. Probably people who commit infanticide, it's probably very unlikely to be just a lack of bonding. There will be something else going on as well.
You do read about, say, Roman, I mean, maybe Roman practices were very unusual, but there's this like period of deliberation when the baby was born for a week or two, and then the patriarch would decide whether or not to expose the baby. But anyway, that's a grim area of history. And I was,
Yeah, I think
yes.
historically, you hear a lot about, the Spartans used to leave weak babies on hillsides and that kind of thing.
Yes.
They're probably very cultural reasons for that. There's not a
Yeah,
biological reason to do that.
Okay. So on the interventions point, let's stick with mothers for the time being. When
Yeah.
mothers are struggling to bond with their babies, what interventions might work?
Well, first of all, it's very important to try and uncover what the basis of that is. Because if it's something like trauma, then alongside intervention, you have to help the woman deal with the trauma that's preventing her. So if it's a traumatic birth or it's a difficult pregnancy or whatever, it's very important that you talk that through. And that's not my job. That's the psychologist or psychotherapist's job. When we talk about interventions, what we try to do is we try to build a secure attachment, and we try to use our knowledge of neurochemistry to help that mother produce the neurochemicals that are going to help her bond, basically. So the neurochemicals which underpin love are there to help you develop bonds. They're there to give you a hand. So oxytocin and dopamine are very important at the beginning. And they are there to kind of orientate you towards this new being in your life and block out all the other stuff going on so that you orientate towards that baby. They actually decrease some of the risk detection area so that you feel more confident looking after your baby. And dopamine motivates you to do it even when it's really, really hard, basically. And then there's another chemical known as beta endorphin, which is actually the chemical of long-term love, which underpins long-term love. And there are lots of practices that release beta endorphin. So touch releases it, laughter, dancing, exercise, singing, all these different things. So what we tend to do with parents who can't or find it hard to attach is we start to try and teach them the behaviors which will enable them to begin a bond. So there's two key things that build bonds really powerfully with parents and babies. First is touch. The second is eye gaze. So touch is very straightforward. So, for example, we might teach baby massage. We might teach, things that we can do during bath time. We might teach sort of exercises we can do in terms of singing or dancing or that kind of thing with the baby. We also have to teach some parents, and it's more often than you think actually, how to play with their baby. Because some people don't know how to play with children, and it might be they weren't played with as children themselves. Or quite often these days, the first time any of us experience a baby is when it's our own. Now that's actually quite recent for that to happen because we don't have extended families. In the past, you would have been brought up around babies. You would have known how to interact with the baby. So sometimes we have to help people do that because they don't feel confident. And, what we're talking about with play is sensitive reciprocal play. So it's about tuning into your baby's needs empathetically and giving a sort of lovely give and take flow of play, responding to their prompts, responding to their noises, responding and keeping what we call appropriate eye gaze. So eye gaze is really important. And that's why phones are troublesome around babies, because babies search for your eye gaze. They search to look into your eyes. So if you're looking at your phone, for them, that's very alienating. So we try to teach good eye gaze. And it's a very slow process, but by teaching people how to produce these things through touch, by teaching people how to play with their baby, to really tune in and really get that reciprocity and that sensitivity and that real understanding of where the baby's going, that helps to build that bond. And it's slow, but it starts to really, and the joy of it is when you get to a certain point, because you personally are getting such a neurochemical reward from it, it starts to be something that you enjoy. It's not stressful anymore. It's actually enjoyable, and it's quite addictive, actually. So it's about getting over that hump, and then people tend to be okay. But it's about supporting people to find their way of interacting with their baby that's going to produce these chemicals and produce this bond.
I guess breastfeeding is a shortcut to much of this.
Breastfeeding is a shortcut. There is an advantage to breastfeeding in bonding because it produces oxytocin and it produces beta endorphin. And so it's a very hormone-heavy procedure to do. What I will say is that's only the case if you don't find breastfeeding stressful. If you find breastfeeding stressful, then what you actually end up with is a mummy full of cortisol and a baby full of cortisol. And that's not a good thing for bonding. So I'm very much an advocate of doing what is appropriate for you and your baby. If breastfeeding is something that you find very nice and natural and easy, and it takes time for everyone to establish it, but if once you've established it, that's something you really love to do, that's brilliant. That's absolutely brilliant. And it is a bit of a head start when it comes to bonding. If you can't do it for whatever reason, then there are other things you can do. And even feeding with a bottle, okay, you're not going to get the neurochemical hit because you're not letting down milk, you're not doing all those sorts of things, but you're still touching, you're still often eye gazing. That stare that a baby gives to you when you're feeding, that's still a very powerful experience, even if you're bottle feeding. So I always just, I find it, I think parents have enough pressure on them as it is without then saying you've got to do this because this is the best thing to do. I think what's the best thing to do is what is the best thing for you and your baby's relationship.